there's upheaval in the Caribbean, in Haiti. Not actually in Cuba, though a lot of people worked hard to try and create some mayhem there. It seems, for the time being at least, to have failed. Meanwhile, the pink tide is coming in again in Latin America, with President Castillo being sworn in as the new president of Peru. Time for a survey of the horizon in Latin America. I'm joined by a very considerable expert and activist on Latin American issues. She stood for president of the United States just last year and got the best vote for a socialist in 44 years. Quite an accomplishment, that. Her name is Gloria La Riva, and she joins me now. Gloria, thank you for getting up very early in San Francisco to talk to me today. I summarized that correctly, didn't I? There is murder and mayhem in Haiti, but there isn't in Cuba. Yet Western media fastened on what turned out to be manifestations of a rather small and transitory nature in neighboring Cuba. How do you compare and contrast these two things?
Thank you so much for having me on your show, Mr. Galloway. Yes, as people saw around the world, what the Western media focused on July 11, Sunday, was a very small number of people protesting in Cuba, but it was also coordinated among all those people that suddenly sprung on that day, and it hasn't appeared ever since, because these were demonstrations that were planned by the U.S., by the fronts for the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, and USAID. The U.S. has taken advantage of this very severe crisis for Cuba with the pandemic, where it has had to shut down the tourism industry, making the income of the country, shrink down to almost nothing, and also the 60-year blockade of the U.S. So it's remarkable that Cuba has maintained, except for these demonstrations. And then what took place 6 days later was a huge turnout of over 100,000 Cubans to say, don't mess with our island. And then you see what has happened in Haiti of these decades of U.S. domination, in which the only time a president was elected, a Democratic president, Aristide, was then overthrown at the hands of the U.S. And so that's the contrast between those two countries.
Now, I've been in Cuba during some very dark days, the special period when the Soviet Union disappeared and 80% of Cuba's income and supplies disappeared almost overnight. Do you compare the situation in Cuba today with that special period?
I've asked people about that because I just was in Cuba in this June, and it's similar, but people say it's not as bad as then. It was incredibly difficult then, as you know. There was almost no food. And what they have now is that they've developed a biotechnology industry that's just remarkable since the 1990s. The tourism, of course, was developed. And I would say that the U.S. would like to create a situation like that. What the U.S. has done to enhance the economic difficulties is remarkable. Under the Trump administration, 243 measures were carried out against the country, including the remittances were cut off last year. That's been $1.5 billion that the Cubans from the U.S. sent to their loved ones on the island, which really helps generate some economy. That's been cut off entirely. And then the oil that Venezuela was sending on a regular basis, that has been blocked for over a year. And so Cuba has had to spend money that they didn't plan to for fuel on the oil and on the international market, which is another cost for them. The U.S. has heavily targeted banks. Cuba searches constantly for a new bank that will accept their transactions of U.S. dollars and euros. So they're being strangled. And it's similar to the 90s, but not exactly the same.
I'm puzzled by President Biden's continuation of President Trump's policy towards Cuba. After all, he was the vice president to Barack Obama, who actually visited Cuba and completely changed, well, not entirely changed, but considerably modified the U.S. policy on things like remittances and flights and so on. How does President Biden justify this U-turn on the previous administration of which he was a part?
Well, since President Eisenhower, who was the first president actually from the Cuban Revolution, their tactics have changed, but not the overall objective, which is to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. So yes, it seems incongruous from what you say that Biden was vice president under Obama. And then Biden promised during the campaign last year, he said, I will go back to the measures of President Obama, which was allowing the remittances and actually individual travel of Americans to Cuba.
Well, they're not going to bomb Cuba, although some Cuban exiles are pushing for them to take military action. But I don't think any U.S. administration would be foolish enough to try to replicate the Bay of Pigs. At the same time, the SOS Cuba and Cuba Libre hashtags and so on have all now dissipated. The demonstrations, such as they were a one-off. What do you think the U.S. does from here? Do they just give up on trying to regime change Cuba?
Well, it's apparent from what you say, the hashtag SOS Cuba and SOS Matanzas, which were where the highest number of COVID cases is right now. What they're doing was with the benefit of beaming in millions, literally, of tweets on the day before and the day of those protests. And so when Biden last Friday said, we're going to bring internet to the Cuban people, they want to use that as a transmission belt to try to foment protests again. And you're right. I don't think that the U.S. is going to bomb Cuba, first of all, because Cuba has a defense and they're so close to the United States. But what I think they plan to do is, again, to create a real pressure cooker environment. The U.S. is hinting, for example, that they may try to create another immigration crisis. The U.S. and Cuba agreed in 1995 that the U.S. would allow 25,000 Cubans to enter the U.S. per year on legal visas so they could fly instead of trying to take a raft. But that has been violated by the U.S. The U.S. hasn't honored that agreement. And now, as of the last 2 years, the U.S. announced, under Trump again, for Cubans who want to get a visa, instead of going to the U.S. Embassy in Havana, now you have to go to Costa Rica. And they say, and by the way, plan to stay there for a few weeks because it may take a while. And that doesn't guarantee that you'll get a visa. So what they want to do is say, you can't leave the island unless you try to leave by boat. And so when they're hinting at a possible crisis, this is a kind of manipulation and operation that the U.S. is engaging in.
Cuba is not without friends, of course. China is a friend, Russia is a friend. But in Latin America, the very short period of isolation of Cuba appears to be coming to an end. The president of Mexico has just sent an aid ship in defiance of U.S. policy. Countries that had right-wing anti-Cuban governments are beginning to change hands, the latest of which, as I said in the introduction, is Peru. How do you calibrate the current Latin American stance towards Cuba and U.S. destabilization attempts?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that about Peru. And in addition, what had happened right when Obama was first running in 2008 was that Daniel Ortega had been elected in Nicaragua. Rafael Correa had been elected in Ecuador. And we had other presidential candidates too, as well. And Bolivia, Evo Morales had been elected. And Obama warned in his Latin America speech that that was not going to continue. And in fact, what we saw was the overthrow of Mel Zelaya in Obama's first year, 2009, in Honduras. And so then now we see a reverting, as you said, Peru. And in addition, even though Evo Morales was overthrown in a fascist coup, Luis Arce from Bolivia, a leftist, is now president again. And this is very hopeful, I think. Now we see that next year the Brazilian elections will take place, and Lula is very likely to win. This is going to be very disrupting to the United States plans. And so what was really hopeful in these last few days is not only did the 2 Navy ships go from Mexico with huge amounts of aid, but President López Obrador said to the world that the OAS, the Organization of American States, which is dominated by the US and Canada, he said it should be abolished, which is a huge declaration to make from Mexico, which is a longtime friend of Cuba, has never abandoned Cuba. In fact, when Cuba was expelled in 1962 from the OAS for being Marxist-Leninist, it was Mexico who said, we don't agree. So he said that, and he also said the United Nations should declare the Cuban people a patrimony of humanity for its resistance to the US blockade. These are major, major words to say from one of the most important countries of Latin America.
Gloria La Riva, thank you for joining us on board the Sputnik.
Thank you.